Health segment. We have Dr. Bridge Bombi with Centric Health. Of course, he's one of the physician owners of Bakersfield Heart Hospital. He has been with me at my side, which I deeply appreciate, by the way, to help us understand this pandemic we've been going through. And boy, oh boy, I don't want to get ahead of myself, but things really look like they're opening up fast. Perhaps too fast. Let's hope not. But you see it in Major League Baseball. You see it around the country. They're announcing now concerts in May for regular seating. This is a country that is anxious. It is chomping at the bit to get back to some degree of normalcy. Let's get at it. Dr. Bridge Bombi, welcome back, sir. How are you?
Richard, I'm well. How are you?
I'm doing terrific. Thank you, sir. Hey, let me ask you this before we get into it. There was a story yesterday that got a lot of press about Pfizer announcing that it was encouraged that for people who had received the vaccine 6 months prior, that it was still 91+% effective, and also effective against some of the variants. I think that's all well and good. My thought was, and maybe I'm wrong here. That's the reason I have you on. But I was under the impression that I would certainly hope these things would last 6 months or a year or 6 years. I was just assuming that you get this vaccine and maybe we need a booster, but it would be largely effective for a long period. Is that not the case, or what is the case?
I think, Richard, we've been extremely fortunate, as we have previously discussed, that the genome of this virus has been very stable. It's a much richer genome than a regular flu virus because it has a bigger genome. It has a self-correcting mechanism in which its replication, its next generation is edited for accuracy. So it's less likely to have mutants. So the lack of mutations encourages stability of the genome and gave us a good target to attack. That's why we didn't have one. We had multiple vaccines. They were able to successfully defeat it. And as far as the longevity is concerned, one we have to be, again, it's very fortunate that the recurrent infections, even in people who have the natural infection, is a rare oddity. If it's in news, it's because it's an exception, not because it is the law. The second thing is the vaccines are actually more effective in generating a richer and more robust immune response. So if you have to extrapolate, you can say that the immune response is going to be more robust and probably more longer lasting. If you look at the SARS-1 infection, it's a sister virus that came, I think, 2003 or so. That had longevity of 2 to 3 years in terms of immunity. But if you look at the T-cell immunity, it extends to 17, 18 years. So it's hard to predict the duration. But so far, I tell you, everything has been a surprise on the positive side, other than the pandemic that hit because of its novelty. It claimed so much life, but it could have been a lot worse. So all the things in terms of immunity, in terms of recurrence of infection, in terms of vaccines being effective for the variants, the virus being effective for the elderly, the vaccine being effective for the elderly, vaccine being effective for the adolescents and younger, it's check. So we have been very fortunate that science, private sector, and the government converged and created a plethora of vaccines which are incredibly effective and safe.
Right. In terms of how fast we open up, when you hear, like the Texas Rangers baseball team in Houston has said, we're opening up and there's going to be no restrictions. If we can get 54,000 people into this stadium, we're going to do it. You have other baseball teams who go, no, we're going to go at 25%. Some have masks, some don't. Does any of that worry you?
CDC issued guidelines today on travel. I think you could generalize those travel guidelines, which basically mean that if you have a fully vaccinated human, then there isn't really any limitation. They can travel. They don't need to be quarantined. They don't need to self-quarantine when they go to a different area, and they don't need to be checked for the infection. But that doesn't mean they don't have to follow the safety measures for two reasons. One, we know that the vaccine is effective in deterring serious infections, but still the data is still being gathered as to the asymptomatic infections and the ability to communicate that infection to the vulnerable. So that would be a disservice to the people who didn't have the vaccine and are vulnerable. So the safety, the mitigating efforts have to be continued. As far as filling the stadiums, I think it would warrant that another war front is brewing, which is called vaccine passports. So it would be necessary for people, if they're going to accumulate in large number, that they show the evidence that they have been vaccinated. And I think that may become a little bit of a cultural war going forward, but that's coming.
That is, I think it's here. I mean, we've already seen the governor of Florida say, we'll never have vaccine passports here in the country. And for some reason, people see that as yet another kind of threat to their liberties. What do you think about these vaccine passports? The idea that if you want to go into areas with 10,000 or 100,000 other people, you have to show proof that you've had your vaccinations. What's your stand on that?
I think it's important to recognize that people who are vaccinated are not going to get infection and probably are less likely to get asymptomatic infection and infect others. But if you're going to have intermingling of people who are susceptible, didn't have the vaccination, infections will occur because some of them will be harboring asymptomatic or somewhat symptomatic infections. So I think the prudence dictates that if there is going to be a gathering, especially in private businesses, I would hope that they have the right to ask the evidence for immunity before exposing the people who elect for one reason or another not to be immunized to be in the same gathering. So I support safety. Yeah. Safety demands vaccination. Safety demands large numbers not gather if they're unvaccinated.
Absolutely. I agree with you. I wouldn't have a problem with that myself. Talking to Dr. Bridge Bombi here. Dr. Bombi, is it important? We've never answered the question, at least to my knowledge, of the origin of this virus. Did it emerge from animals in Wuhan? Did it come out of a lab? Was it man-made? Were there any, sinister motives behind it? How important is it that we find out what the origin for this virus is?
For any pathology to be extirpated, for any disease to be cured, you need to have a diagnosis. You need to have to what we call pathophysiology. We need to understand why, when, and how did it happen. So that's important for us to understand purely from a scientific standpoint and to make sure such recurrences are prevented. The Chinese government left a lot to be answered. First of all, the origin of this viral escape is being traced back to September and October because it takes a certain critical mass. So typically when an animal virus jumps to humans, it's not that well trained. It needs some generations before it improves its contagiousness to infect or create a pandemic. The way the pandemic originated in Wuhan, it seemed to have the ability to infect humans at a much faster rate than a human naive virus would. So it seemed like that the virus was being developed in the laboratory, and it escaped. It's it's easy to conceive of sinister motive, but it's more likely that it was an accidental infection that escaped and spread to the vulnerables in that neighborhood. So the Chinese have never really communicated, have never really allowed an independent audit. And WHO, which was in cahoots and kind of regurgitated what was fed by the Chinese to the rest of the world, went back 15 months later, and even then they were denied access.
Right.
So that gives you sufficient grounds to question the authenticity of the claim that it came from a wet market.
Right.
It's more likely a virus that was being developed, not developed in the sense of a bioterror weapon, but worked on in a laboratory that accidentally escaped. And it's a common knowledge that Chinese government had quarantine for their people for the domestic borders, while allowing international travel to continue, and thus seeding the whole world with a nasty pathogen.
Yeah, absolutely. Can we trust the World Health Organization, WHO? I know that was a big point of contention with the Trump administration, less so with the Biden administration.
I think I question everything. This is if you go back, the SARS-1. So the same process. There was a deception, there was a denial, there was a cover-up. And none of the people who are pandemic sleuths smelled anything. The same thing happened all over again. Yes, I expect the Communist Party in China to deceive and hide, but I also want our technological and scientific prowess to work around it. When they say there is no sound here, we should be able to listen to the absence of sound. I take the blame on our side that our pandemic sleuths should have seen things having failed in the SARS-1 infection. And also, the world should be more cognizant going forward that when China is trying to protect its own, how come it's leaving international borders open? So I think we've been not once bitten, we've been bitten twice. But hopefully we have learned our lesson.
Wow, that's so interesting. Dr. Bomby, when we're doing well in this country, I believe the last I had heard is about was it a third of Americans have been vaccinated? Is that what you heard?
Yeah, I think somewhat 40% are vaccinated, about 17, 18% or 20% are fully vaccinated. About 100 million shots have been given. So there is a lot of positivity in the fight against the virus.
Talk to me about the politics of vaccinating the rest of the world, and we have the COVAX campaign, but and you have and you have spoken eloquently about this in the past, basically saying we cannot allow vast parts of this globe to go unvaccinated because we're just it'll be a fertile ground for new viruses to emerge. How confident are you that the industrialized nations have an idea or a plan to get vaccines to the neediest, the underdeveloped nations, in a way that will reach herd immunity not only in our country but globally?
So let me begin by saying, Richard, there still is a constituency in our country that continue to question the science behind the vaccine. To say that it was developed too quickly. To tell you, give you example, the Human Genome Project that was completed in 2003 took 13 years and $3 billion to decipher the genome in a human. Now, that can be done for $100. So it's down to about $500. It will be down to $100 in the next year or two. So the whole human genome, if Richard Bean wants to know what the whole genome is, that will be deciphered for $100, and that information can be used for cancer surveillance, for organ transplant surveillance, for individually tailored medication. So I want to reassure the people in general that this science is very robust. It has been in the work for 40 years. It just that the full commitment was given between the scientific world, private sector, and the government to develop this vaccine. It took relentless effort and collaboration. It is not a rush vaccine. It's a phenomenal success of human endeavor. So it's efficacious and it's safe. Please don't allow those thoughts to contaminate your mind. But because the susceptibility will help vaccine to the virus to grow in different parts of the world, because it is a global fire. It needs to be put out near simultaneously across the globe. If the virus has opportunity to continue to grow in susceptible humans, it will mutate, and it can also ping pong between animals and humans, and that allows another path for it to mutate in an adverse manner that can potentially work around the immunity that we have gathered. So it's incumbent upon the people who are more resourceful that they provide access and availability of vaccine to people who have less access. So that is the COVAX program, in which the people, the rich countries, are accumulating the dosages of the vaccine and trying to make sure the whole world is universally vaccinated to put this plague out of humanity. The question that comes, is it fair for the people, for the Modernas and BioNTechs and the Pfizers of the world, who have the intellectual property rights, for them to let go on the intellectual property rights and allow access to other governments? And the answer to that is absolutely not, because intellectual property, if a government, state mandates that you ought to let go on the intellectual property rights, it's a state-sponsored piracy. At the same time, the corporations have an obligation, when they preserve the intellectual property rights and they have financial incentives, they also have a moral and social obligation that they don't become participants in an avoidable loss of life. So they have to expand the production, expand the access, and work out economic deals that are manageable for both sides.
Yeah, boy, that's so true. You have that friction between those two thoughts. You know, I was outside going to my car the other day, and a local teacher, he lives behind me, and he walks his toddler every afternoon, and he has been off, hasn't been in the classroom, getting ready to go back. And I was talking to him, and he asked me if I'd gotten the vaccine. I said I had, and I said, well, what about you? He says, I'm not getting it. And I said, well, why not? And he said exactly what you said. He says, well, I believe this thing was rushed. You know, I don't believe, they spent enough time on it. He used that word rushed. And then he said, which I've heard before, he goes, I don't want anything changing my DNA. Well, does this change your DNA?
So that's another fiction created in the dark recesses of the web. This is a messenger RNA-based vaccine, the Moderna and the Pfizer. They don't go inside the nucleus. So there is a cell, imagine a circle, and in the circle, imagine another small dot called nucleus. Nucleus is where our genome is. So that's the nerve center of our genetic code that produces, through multiple layers, proteins in the body. The messenger RNA just goes in the cell outside the nucleus. It does not impact our DNA. It starts at a much lower level. So it's like water cannot flow upstream. It just counter to its nature. No, these vaccines cannot alter the human DNA.
Oh, that's good to hear there. I thought that was the case. I thought you had told me that before. All right, well, we're out of time here, 2:26. Dr. Brahmi, it's always great having you on. I hope you have a good weekend here, sir, and I thank you again.
Happy Easter.
Okay, happy Easter to you, my friend. Thanks.